Hello and welcome to my presentation on part 1 of the essential question. As a reminder, in case you haven't read it or need a refresher, the essential question is, as incunabula and printing became an ingrained part of Western civilization, what caused books to be more readily available and what was the result of this paradigm shift? In this presentation, I would like to talk specifically about the reasons why I think that printing and more readily available books became an option in Europe in the 15th century. There are 5 different things that I'm going to be talking to you about today, and I believe that all of them play a crucial part in the rise of printing and more readily available books. The first item that I would like to talk about is the printing press. Handwritten manuscripts took a very long time to reproduce, and the text accuracy depended entirely on how astute the scribe who was rewriting the text was. This resulted in many typos or little quirks, which have benefit now, as collectors may argue. However, at the time, there was no real way to ensure that everybody was reading a standardized version of anything. As people began reading more and needing more books, a need for a faster method and a more accurate method of printing became very apparent. The printing press was a tool developed from technology that was originally used to press grapes or olives. In very similar fashion, the printing press presses either a wood block or a frame with type attached to it. It presses it to paper with ink, and then it creates a page with print on it. As I just mentioned, there are 2 types of printing that were very common during the Incunabula era, which are woodblock and typographical printing. Woodblocks are very similar to stamps today. They were made out of wood, and images and words were carved in relief fashion onto the block, and the block was inked and then pressed onto the paper, and these blocks could be used over and over again. However, once the carving was complete, it was complete. There was no changing that carving. Typographical print was slightly different because it involved movable type, so individual letters were placed onto a frame in the order that they needed to go for the words and the phrases and sentences that made up a page. The frame was then inked and pressed to a piece of paper. This innovation, I believe, is what helped books initially become more readily available. Without the printing press, if we had continued to handwrite manuscripts, books would not be as available as they are today. So, moving right along, the next innovation that I believe helped books and printing get a foothold in Europe is the papermaking process. Previously, books were printed on parchment or vellum, both of which are animal skins, and this process was a very long, painstaking process. Multiple dozens of animals had to be killed and then skinned, and the skin had to be treated so that there were no blemishes or hairs left on the skin, and treated so that the ink would stay, and cut, and it took a very long time. It took months to create a piece of parchment or pieces of parchment from one group of slaughtered animals. The rise of paper in Europe was actually fashioned after Eastern tradition, founded in China, taking plant material, turning it into a pulp, shaping the pulp using forms and then allowing that to dry, pressing the water out of it and allowing it to dry, came to Europe and it stuck. And it makes a lot of sense because while paper making in this way is still relatively slow compared to how we can make mass-produced paper today, for the time it was much faster. The image that I have here shows a small paper mill. You can see the two people on the right-hand side. There's one holding a form, a grate sort of thing, over the vat of pulp. Old rags and linen, so old clothing or old dish rags or towels were used. They were ground up and put into a vat with water and allowed to ferment, and they were stirred up, and it created a very pulpy, kind of soupy mixture that was then put onto a frame and pressed. The water was, as much water as possible was expelled, and then the sheet was taken off and pressed again to get out any further moisture. And as you can see in that picture, there are sheets hanging out to dry. That was probably the longest part of the process, is allowing the paper to dry completely. It was then treated so that the ink would stay. However, this was a relatively inexpensive and time-effective way to create a medium for printing. And I believe that because it was both time-effective and cost-effective, this new way of making paper allowed printing to really grow, and it allowed books to be more accessible to people. Being cheaper meant that people from all sorts of economic backgrounds, not just the high upper class, could afford books any longer. It could be anybody. It could be people from a lower or middle class background. I also believe that keeping up with how fast the printing press worked was an important aspect of why paper helped. Printing was a lot faster than handwriting, so there needed to be a process to create the medium to keep up with that demand, and paper making certainly did. So the next man that I would like to talk about is Johann Gutenberg. Probably a very obvious choice to discuss when talking about printing and the growth of printing in Europe. He is oftentimes credited with bringing printing to Europe, introducing that technology and really tailoring it to fit bookmaking. Because as I said earlier, it was technology taken from wine and olive presses, which the idea is right. However, the technology certainly could always be improved if it's not for printing initially. So he revealed the technology in Germany in the mid 15th century, and he also invented typographical printing, which is perhaps the very, very important innovation to all of this, because typographical printing allowed printers to reuse the type. So a type is the stamp with the letter on it. Remove them and reorder them to create multiple pages. They were not stuck. They were not just one page of one book. They could be multiple pages of multiple books. And this efficiency and reusability was a very crucial step in making printing in books more readily available. It still took a very long time to, by hand, organize all of the letters and pages. However, as I will talk about later, that was also an important aspect of the growth of printing and the rise of books in Europe. Gutenberg, ironically, though he is now viewed as the father of printing, was not necessarily all that successful in his lifetime. In 1455, he went bankrupt due to a bad business dealing with his partner Johann Fust. and it's rather sad. He died a few years later. However, he's very much revered. His 42-line Bible is something that collectors would love to have their hands on. And he really did influence and affect the way that printing grew and became such a mainstay in Western culture. So the next thing that I would like to talk about is the rise of education and how that affected the book business and the need for books and the growth of printing in Europe. This image is of the university at Bologna, since it is one of the oldest universities. And I felt that it was appropriate because it shows the permanence of education. Education, specifically higher education, was not available to everybody in the 15th century or prior. However, it was growing. It was certainly becoming a common aspect of life for people. Higher education grew in the 12th and 13th centuries, and by the 15th century, as the Renaissance was being was in its growth period, it's starting up, a new wave of scholars wished to break society free from narrow-mindedness. They wanted people to be educated. They wanted people to know what the ancient Greeks thought of the world and highly valued that perspective. They wanted to think about life and all aspects of life, what it was to be human, what it was to speak a language, what it was to be religious. And this certainly created a need for books, because as more people went to college, and perhaps people not just of a very high class, but perhaps people of a more middle class or a lower high class, started to go to universities, a need for books certainly rose. Students used to borrow pieces of textbooks from what was considered the university librarian, and they would copy those pieces of books so that they could at least have that piece, and then perhaps they would get together with their classmates who had other pieces, and they would eventually form a whole book. However, that was very painstaking and a very long process, and it was just easier if books could be had by each individual student. And so I do believe that this need, this desire for more books for education, necessitated printing. And printing grew, at least with this base of buyers. They would always have students needing to buy books for university. And so I do believe that education helped spurn the growth of printing and spurn the availability of books within European culture during the 15th century. And lastly, I want to talk about the fact that printing was a lucrative business. It was expensive to get started. However, once you owned that press and, either bought the type, if you were doing typographical, or bought the wood blocks, once you owned those pieces, you were no longer bound to create just one thing. You could create, especially with typographical printing, you could create whatever books were in demand. And the printing process, I kind of alluded to it earlier, was a multi-hand process. It was not just one or two people sitting in a room working together. It was a big business, because you had to have the paper, and that was one, perhaps, shop or mill. You had to have the ink, which was another business that you needed to rely on. Then the actual printing, which required somebody to organize the types, which are the little letter stamps on the frame. Somebody to press that, ink it, and press it onto paper. And then somebody to take cut and fold those pages as they needed to be cut and folded. And once that happened, that the book wasn't done. The book had to then be sent to another business to be bound, and perhaps even another business to be embellished in any way that the buyer may have commissioned. So illumination with handwritten manuscripts may have happened very frequently because the scribe or whoever was creating the book was there and could add some color or some pictures and diagrams. However, with printing, the printers themselves did not necessarily do all of that work. They would send it out to be done by a third party, and the third party would draw, would illuminate the letters or add marginalia, whatever the customer desired. And so this business provided a lot of opportunities for jobs. And when there are a lot of jobs in a market, people are happy. When there are not a lot of jobs, people are unhappy. So clearly, the print business was going to be successful because it required so many different levels of help and very widespread help. And it was a job that wouldn't run out of business. People wouldn't stop desiring books. There would always be a market, and it allowed people to be smart businessmen. In the next part, I will talk about a couple of very smart businessmen in the world of printing, but this image here is of a flyer from a printer, and it's kind of funny to think about. Even in 15th century Europe, people were handing out flyers for business and trying to get people to buy their goods using flyers, and that happened, and smart businessmen would sell themselves and sell their work to continue their business and to continue being successful. And I do believe that business, the opportunity presented by printing, helped printing grow. If printing had not been so lucrative, it wouldn't have grown. But because the people who began it and really kind of plotted out the work, they were smart about it, and it grew. And because of this, because it grew to such a big business level, books became more and more available. I talked about education just a moment ago. Because there were so many books circulating, it was becoming possible to start buying secondhand books, something that wouldn't have existed when people were handling, very expensive, handwritten, personalized manuscripts. But the print business began to change the way that people looked at books and what their function was. And I will talk more about that in the next part, part 2, which is the effects of the rise of printing and books being more readily available. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this. There is a quiz at the end of this exhibit. There are some further pictures and a little bit more information that perhaps I didn't touch on the web page. And at the very end, you can play a Kia game to test what you've learned and see if you've retained some of what I've talked about. And I certainly hope that you have enjoyed this, and I will talk to you soon.